Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Cranfield University.
Welcome.
欢迎你
Welcome. Karibu Cranfield.
Welcome.
Namaste.
Welcome to Cranfield School of Management.
Good morning, good afternoon, from wherever you're calling from today. Welcome to Cranfield School of Management. Today is the fourth instalment of the Future of Everything Expert Series. Today we've got Professor David Denyer taking us through organisational resilience in the never normal, which I have to say so far is definitely the most exciting title that we've had today. So we're going to go through a few housekeeping guidance, because this is the first time we are using the amazing Grenville Turner studio today. The rules are the same though. Everyone's on mute because there are a lot of people dialing in today. However, we do encourage you to always submit your questions. We've got a team monitoring the chat. We've already received a number of questions. They are coming through to us in the studio. So please, please, please do interact with us. This is an interactive session and we are looking forward to answering your questions. The first half is going to be David sharing his insight into organisational resilience. The second half will be a Q&A. So Professor David Denyer is our Professor of Leadership and Organisational Change. Previously, he's been named HR Magazine's most influential UK thinker. He works with many organisations to build capabilities of leadership, resilience, high reliability and change. And on top of all of that, he's also our Commercial and Development Director at Cranfield School of Management. So I'm very impressed you've managed to make time for us today. Thank you so, so much.
No, great to be here.
My understanding is you're going to take us through essentially three parts. What is organisational resilience? Why does it go wrong?
Yep.
And the third part is how can we change that? So I'm going to start with a really obvious question. What is organisational resilience and how does that apply to organisations?
Okay, yeah, so great question to start with. So for me, organisational resilience is about how do we as organisations prepare for disruptive events? How do we respond to them? How might we learn from them? Just to give you an example of that, I was speaking just last week to a teacher who had just had an Ofsted inspection of their school. One of the questions that came up in that conversation was, how do you build resilience for the future? And the teacher, like, how do we answer that? It's really easy to say, what do we do when COVID hit us? And what were some of the things we responded to? But what have you put in place to make sure that you're more resilient for the future is a much more difficult question. I think a lot of people, probably those online at the moment, probably thinking, how do I even think about that? How do I make sure that I don't fall into some of the traps that we've had in the past? And what do I do practically on Monday morning to kind of make a difference around this? So that's what we're trying to cover, I think.
Absolutely. And it must feel relentless because we've actually been going through such a period of change. You've mentioned the never normal. Yeah. And we're thinking, how do you even have the energy to get on to the next round when you're still really reacting? So, I mean, some of the questions we've had, we had one of our questions actually said, was there a normal? When has there ever been a never normal?
Well, I think that's a really good question, actually. I mean, the title we used for this program, for this webinar, obviously we've had a lot of period of disruption and uncertainty in past. You know, you could go back to what, like 1939, and of course it's going to be a real period of disruption and lots of, you know, affecting everyone. I think the danger that we have now is people are talking about like the old normal and the new normal, as though we're going to come out of the pandemic over the last 2 years that we've had all of this disruption, and we'll go back to some form of normality. And of course, there's going to be more uncertainty and disruption than we've seen before. And I think we'll kind of get into that when we talk about some of the sort of concerns that we have for the future. Yeah.
Well, probably a good lead into that, and I know you're going to take us through what organisational resilience looks like. Yeah. We had a fabulous question, which I'd really like to start with, which is, Where is the tipping point between protecting the business from operational risk and staying competitive and profitable?
Yeah, this is the question, the hammer that hits the nail on the head here, because this is the big question. Like, how do you build resilience and kind of manage the risk, control risk, but also be really competitive and also innovative into the future? And we've actually got a model that I developed a few years ago that I think we can bring up on the screen here, that I did in conjunction with the British Standards Institution on resilience. And it talks about some of the tensions in resilience. Now, on this webinar, I don't want to get into sort of being really academic going through a model, so I've got a couple of props here that I want to use to kind of explain this. So those people listening to this at the moment, when you say, what do you think resilience is, organizational resilience is, I bet there's a bunch of people watching this that will go, it's actually about how do we control risk, how do we put in place some defenses to stop things happening to the organization. It's like building some robustness. Now, a lot of organizations do this either kind of explicitly or they kind of implicitly have a set of assumptions around what creates resilience. And a lot of this is driven by a mindset that consistency and standardization is the answer to resilience. So my first prop here, if you take different aspects of an organization and you go, okay, so we've got our goals, we've got a standardized set of goals, everyone's working to the same objective. And then we've got a standardized set of processes. So we've got standard operating procedures for everything. And then we want a standard set of behaviors. So we run a load of compliance training to make sure everyone's following the procedure. And then in many organizations now, we're even standardizing our values. So we've all got to have the same set of values. So this is really about driving a standardization agenda. And what these organizations do, this is the bottom left quadrant of this model. This version of resilience says that what we do is we build robustness by building that together, and we create a nice, robust organization that's really standardized, because we know that any deviation from kind of normal, any kind of errors might lead to problems. So we create this kind of defensive organization, defenses in depth, okay? And that's like one version of resilience, and you see that a lot in kind of high hazard industries, yeah? Now, what the problem with this isn't very commercially viable. You can't make much money doing this, and every organization wants to have competitive advantage. So what you want to do is try and get more from less. So we've got our resources here, and what we'll do in the next bit is we'll try and make this spread out so we get a bit more from the resources that we've got, and we stretch the system and we improve the system. We're getting more from less, and we're actually doing more from this. This is more competitive, but the problem is this starts to become a bit brittle.
A little bit wobbly.
So a little bit wobbly there. But that's still like the standardization agenda. So that's the top left of the quadrant. We optimize, we do what we've always done, same process, same technology, same resources, but we're just stretching it, getting more and more from less. That's kind of like the efficiency agenda. And that is an aspect of resilience. If you don't improve, you're not going to be resilient. If you don't make any money, you're not going to be resilient in the long term. So that's one view. The second view is that resilience is actually about flexibility. Another prop. So this is the bouncing back version of resilience, bottom right quadrant on that model. And a lot of people say resilience is about this kind of flexibility. So you stretch the system and you bounce back to where you were. Okay, and that's one. So what we do in organizations is we create a whole set of like business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans. We empower people to be responsive. We have devolved teams, and they're all like told that you can be creative problem solvers and you can kind of stretch and you can bounce back. But the problem is, do we really want to bounce back? That's still quite defensive. So the kind of progressive top right version of that, another one of my props here, is a piece of blue tack.
Oh,
so
beautiful and new and
yeah, so there's
pristine.
a point to this as well, is that I can now create anything I like from this. And as a leader in the organization, you're probably a bit worried about what I'm making with this on camera and where this is going. So I can kind of make anything. And that's like part of this, because that top right box actually makes us a little bit anxious because we're letting go of control. Okay, so we're actually not controlling risk. This could go anywhere. You've got people going in the whole organization being really creative and innovative. Now, this is great. This is a great version of resilience. One of the things is we can never put that flat again and put it back in the box. So we're not going back to where we are. It's not about bouncing back, it's about bouncing forward. And the whole point of this model, which hopefully I've kind of illustrated there, is that all four of those are absolutely crucial for resilience. It cannot be that you are singularly preoccupied with one of those boxes. Every one of those on the model has a failure. So if you put too many controls in place, you can become very stagnant as an organization. If you have a lot of responsiveness, it can become really fragmented. If you have a lot of optimization, you can become very brittle as an organization. And if you do too much innovation, it can become completely chaotic as an organization. And you see like lots of different organizations have problems because they've got a version of resilience that isn't fit for what they're trying to do. So resilience for a nuclear power station is going to be very different, probably more bottom left, than a high-tech startup. But what we see all the time is that organizations and their culture and their approach to resilience isn't fit for the environment that they're in.
It's an interesting point. And if it was that simple, there wouldn't be any sort of organisations wouldn't be going through the turbulence time that they have had. And we have, over the last 15 years, had some interesting times. We've had the financial crisis, we've had Brexit, COVID, Ukraine. If it's as simple as this model, why didn't we see them coming, and why haven't we been better prepared? Yeah,
so this model's about how you might structure and organise for resilience, and it's got to be dynamic. That has to be constantly changing according to your environment. I think what we see all the time is more like this image, where organizations are looking back at past success. It's like the leaders in the organization here got the noise cancelling headphones on. They probably did have some of the warning signs. Some of the weak signals were there about what might happen with all of those events that you mentioned. There may be people in the organization that spoke up but weren't really listened to about where might we be vulnerable, where might we have some issues, but we kind of focused on past success. It was I thought really interestingly, the 9/11, so the Twin Towers, the inquiry into the Twin Towers, if you look at that inquiry report, has a whole section in it that talks about disasters are a failure of imagination. Like, organizations cannot imagine that it can happen to them. How many times do we hear that we are different? We've got a different system, different process. We're not like those other organizations. So you kind of distance yourself from difference. We drive out some of that imagination. And I also think that the second part of what goes wrong is that we often think that analyzing the risk equals preparedness. And I'll just put another little slide here, which I think is really interesting. This is the National Risk Register, the UK's National Risk Register. It was first published in 2008. It was revised, I think, 2017. They're highlighted top right box. So anyone, you probably people on here will know what a risk register does. You look at the probability and the consequence of the risks that your organisation faces. So a national one is no different to an organisational one. Pandemic influenza is the highest consequence, highest probability event that was going to affect the UK. It was top right on the National Risk Register for like the last decade. So doing risk management, and I'm sure there are people watching this that go through a process of risk management where the leaders in the organisation pull off the risk register probably every year. They look at the risk facing the organisation. We have a conversation about risk appetite, and we kind of classify those risks. We do something like that, and it kind of goes back on the shelf. Well, we kind of did that as a nation. It's not that we didn't analyse the risk, it's that we didn't translate that into preparedness. So kind of that analysis of risk, very different to preparedness and our ability to respond.
So it's about it's not about just seeing things coming, it's about the appetite driving the cultural change, the leveraging the right levers in your business to build the right structure.
And I think there is a bit of a danger here. And I think actually you see this at national governmental level as well as at an organisational level, that we get fixated on those individual risks, like what might happen. You mentioned like the Ukraine crisis. Our view of resilience is that actually we need to think about this in a more risk agnostic way. So what I mean by that is are you resilient as an organization regardless of what the risk that or threat that you might face? So instead of sort of saying, would Putin invade Ukraine and what's the probability and consequence of that, it'd probably be better to think about our resilience to what if gas and oil prices go up by 10%, 15%, can we continue to operate as a business? Now we're not saying what might cause that gas price to go up, but are we resilient enough if it does?
So what is it that's on your worry list? What should people be preparing for next?
Yeah, so another good question. And again, it's kind of this more risk agnostic view, but also looking at the complexity of the systems that we face. And this series is called like the future of everything. And I think the future of everything can be captured in terms of what we call 5 capitals. So we've got human capital. So that's the skills, the knowledge, the people that you have in your organization. Is that sufficient for the future? If you look at, I think back in 2020, there were 4 unemployed people for every vacancy in the UK. Wow. And now there are more vacancies than unemployed people. Every organization watching this webinar will be struggling to employ people. If we think about the skills that those people need for the future, are we fit for the future? Do we have like the digital skills that we might need 5, 10 years from now? So that's all about our human capital. So that worries me that we haven't got the skills and knowledge that we need for the future. Our built capital is about our infrastructure, our IT systems, our transport systems, our telecommunications networks, our energy networks and all of that. That built capital also, when you look at the interdependencies that built into that, which we're starting to realize now, like 38% of Europe's gas comes from Russia. Who knew that we were that dependent on Russian gas before this crisis?
And Ukrainian wheat.
Yeah, exactly. If you look at the Ever Given that got stuck in the Suez Canal, that within a week held up £60 billion of trade in just a week, showing how interdependent all of our goods and services networks are. Our IT system, cybercrime's gone up 31% just in the last 12 months, cyber attacks on businesses. I miss social capital. So social capital, World Economic Forum talks about social cohesion erosion as being the 4th biggest risk to the earth, to all societies. And this really is about the lack of trust that we have in government and in democracy, the number of social issues and inequality issues that face us, and thinking about that moving forward. Natural capital obviously is about the natural environment. And we've set this target now of 1.5 degrees, but even that is going to lead to massive displacement, massive amount of future floods, droughts, impacts of climate change, and of course the financial capital, the volatility that we see all the time, massive inflation, massive increasing living standard costs at the moment, cost of living. Well, if you think about that as kind of the sudden shocks that we face, but also just stretch that out 5, 10 years from now, what are these things going to mean for your businesses? And are you fit? Have you actually considered what those trends are going to have in terms of the impact on all organisations?
And that must mean there's a big overlap with sort of sustainability as well, and the natural resource planning that you mentioned, that resilience. And sort of what's the difference between sort of sustainability management and organisational resilience? Yeah,
so these are totally compatible, and okay, they kind of, both terms are being used a lot, aren't they? They kind of come buzzwordy. For me, sustainability is about addressing some of the causes of, and it's particularly around the natural capital. It doesn't really talk so much about the other elements, although it does a bit, but it's primarily about natural capital. And it's about saying, let's start to address the impact of climate change, let's decarbonise and look for a more sustainable future. I think what resilience does is say, well, hold on, if we're not that good at sustainability, we're going to have more droughts, more floods, more famines, more conflict. What have we done to prepare for those? So almost they go hand in hand, because the better we are at sustainability, probably the less disruptive events we have in the future. The worse we are at that, the more disruptive events. So resilience looks at both sides. like the causes and the symptoms.
Sort of optimism, pessimism of sort of, do you think we'll fix it? Probably not. Let's go and plan for the worst anyway. So that's quite interesting. It does mean everything. It's very overwhelming. There's 5 big topics, as you say. The future of everything is in those 5 topics.
Yeah.
A lot of the people on this call today are going to be team leaders, managers. They're not necessarily going to be CEOs in charge of the entire direction of a business. And what can those people do to make a difference? Yeah,
so we've done quite a lot of work with different organisations, all different types over the last few years, particularly around COVID response, but also looking forward, and try to turn this into a more practical set of steps and actions. And to bring it down to a level where anyone can say, well, hold on, like my example of the Ofsted inspection, you say like, so what do I do on Monday morning when I get asked that question? Okay. So there's a set of steps here, and the way that we've worked this now is you can work with an organisation and almost create like a plan on a page around what might be your case for resilience. And what I mean by that is that it is really difficult to think about the resilience of a whole organisation or even a whole department, let alone a whole sector or even a whole city or a whole society. So let's bring it down to the level of the services that you provide. And what are the essential outcomes that you deliver to the end user? So this approach, which actually has been used in banking for some time, looking at financial resilience and also operational resilience, starts very much with an end user focus. Because at the end of the day, who are we trying to be resilient for? It's got to be your customer, your client, the end user of your service. So if we think about that in sort of some practical terms, and this gives a couple of practical examples. Let's go, right, what's an essential outcome of a water company might be to deliver to you drinkable water to your home. An essential outcome of a bank might be to enable you to do a credit card transaction. So you go and you can buy goods and services, right? That's an essential outcome. An essential outcome today is running this webinar, okay? All of those things need to be resilient. Okay, and we bring it down to the level of service. So the first question is like, who is the end user of that service? Do we really understand? Do we empathize with that end user? Do we really understand what a disruption to the service might mean to that end user? So you back to my bottled water example. If you disrupted that service, what's going to be the impact on individuals? And interestingly, for us, that those impacts also correspond to the 5 capitals. So there's going to be a human impact on you. There's probably going to be a social impact, so a reputational impact, a loss of trust in your organization because you haven't delivered the service. Someone's going to get on social media very quickly. Probably a financial impact, might be a natural impact, and might be an operational impact around your ability to actually deliver the service. So we can look from the view of the end user, really empathize with them. We can then say, so what are the impact thresholds that we should set around this? And I think this is one of the big differences to like a view of looking at what is our risk appetite, which feels like really kind of loose. Whereas an impact threshold says, well, this is a level where we would have a cause for concern. This is a level that we would say we should never breach and would be a kind of cause for alarm. And you can even set a kind of upper limit of an intolerable level for that. So if you think about that in terms of the water company example or the banking example, you go and try and buy something in a shop, credit card transaction, doesn't work, you can't buy something. You're going to be a bit upset about that. But what's an acceptable level of disruption? Is it 10 minutes? 20 minutes, half an hour, an hour? We've seen the social impact and the kind of the issue when people are concerned about buying goods and services. People queuing up down the roads to get diesel, people stripping toilet rolls off the shelves. It doesn't actually take long for something like a credit card transaction not to work before you get panic in the system.
And our tolerance actually is so much lower on a consumer's perspective now. Sort of we expect everything to be instant. We're on probably the thresholds have lowered somewhat now that everything's on social, and all it takes is someone to go straight onto Twitter or something else and say, this isn't working, cause a scene. And
exactly. And those thresholds will be very different for different types of organizations, because we place very different expectations on different types of organizations. Some we expect them to absolutely deliver every time, and others it's kind of that disruption or the failure to deliver exactly what you've kind of been normalized. So it's very different in different situations. But for us, we've got to have some sensible conversations about these impact thresholds. The next bit would be, once you understand your impact threshold, then you've got to say, well, how do we actually deliver the service? How do we deliver the service from end to end, from surface to core? And this is where we start to realize that many of our services involve multiple organizations, multiple sections. They cut across all of our silos that we have. They cut across all those 5 capitals. There's people, technology, etc. involved in delivering. All of them need to be funded. So where are the vulnerabilities in that delivery of that essential outcome? Where have we got some weaknesses, some vulnerabilities, single points of failure, kind of lack of resources in areas? And we really understand how it's delivered when it goes well, but we also got to look at when it goes wrong. And you've got to have those conversations, but we kind of map that out. And then the next stage, once you've really understood that service and the service delivery, what we then do is say, well, let's stretch that. So let's stress test it. Let's use a range of severe but plausible scenarios and say, can you continue to deliver that service if I tweak the human capital? Right, 20% of your staff can't come to work. Can you still deliver that service? Like here, we're doing this film studio. We take out 2 of the guys. They've got COVID now.
Please
I'm
don't.
sorry, guys, but they've got. Can we continue to deliver this webinar? What's our contingency plan? If we do that, what about if we remove some of the funding from one of those areas? What if we actually change some of the supply of goods and services through our supply chain? Can we continue to deliver those outcomes and stay within a range that means that we're not breaching those thresholds? And if we can do that and stress test it, if we realize that we can't deliver the outcome, then that actually surely gives us a really good case for investment. Rather than like we did a risk assessment and we talked about our risk appetite, it's literally saying, these are the essential outcomes we're delivering to our end user. So my Ofsted, it's to the student, to the child in the school. Can we deliver that consistently, even when disrupted? If we can't, we've got a decision to make as organizational leaders. Are we going to carry that exposure, that risk, or are we going to make the investment in that? And then that becomes a choice. And I think we often don't like this notion of resilience is a choice, but it's always a choice between how much we want to invest in resilience against like how resilient we really need to be and what the expectations. That focus on essential outcomes and impact thresholds, I think gives us a better investment case. And that's why we call this resilient case. So for me, if we were talking to the guys here in this film studio and run through that process, and we realized that this isn't resilient because maybe we don't have the backup technology or the people, or we don't have the funding to do it, they can make the case for that. But it is up to the organization to decide how much you want to invest.
And I think what's quite interesting is that certainly before today, I heard the word organisational resilience and very much thought it was sort of senior leadership only, but it's very scalable. The fact that this applies to a webinar, and it makes me realise how not resilience planned this webinar is. I hope the studio is still standing. But it is, there's an individual responsibility to make sure you've got your succession planning sorted, and it's not just about the big built capital. That human capital, that social capital is hugely influential. Yeah,
and it goes back to this point about, you know, my blocks of Lego earlier, that we often retreat into saying, look, that's how to do it. Let's create loads of backups and let's put more kind of redundancy and redundant parts into the system so we've got that buffering capacity. But actually what we're talking about is really thinking about resilience as building more options and alternatives to the delivery of the essential outcome. So a lot of like risk thinking, business continuity thinking would be, how quickly would we get this studio up and running again if we had a power cut? If you think about this from resilience as options and alternatives, how can we continue to deliver the webinar even if we can't get this studio up and running again? So that would, in the water company example, at what point are you going to send a water tanker into that local community to provide water? Because that's the essential outcome. At what point will you supply bottled water? Have we had the discussion about the levels when we're going to do that? And we want to make those choices before the next crisis, not in the first few weeks of the crisis, which we did with the pandemic. Like, everyone's making these prioritization decisions in the midst of a crisis. We actually want to make these more proactively. But resilience isn't just a defensive. That's the point I'm trying to make here. It's actually being progressive. It's saying, how can we improve our service? How can we be really innovative in the top right box? Is there a completely different way in which we can deliver this service? So it can lead to improvement and also innovation as well.
And that proactive side, does that mean it tends to favour smaller organisations or larger organisations with more resources at their fingertips?
So that's a really interesting question. Obviously, the smaller organisations tend to be better on the right-hand side of that first model. They tend to be more responsive, more innovative, because they're more agile, they can move faster, they can kind of shift their resources. Whereas large organisations create bureaucracy, red tape, all of that bottom left-hand stuff. But I think a lot of the problem that some of the smaller organisations have is they don't actually have some of those systems and processes in place that enable them to scale when they want to scale the business. You could look at Uber as perhaps a really good example of that, because Uber didn't respond to a disruption. It said, well, we are going to be the disruption. We're going to disrupt the market. We come up with a completely new business model. But if you look, so they're pushing top right. But if you look, particularly when they first started, if you look at them and you look at the legal disputes that they've had in virtually every country that they've operated in, there's been in the news around kind of issues around tax and employee rights and all of that stuff. That's because they didn't have the bottom left. Now, this is why it can't be just saying, well, we need to be in top right. It's got to be a balance of the four according to what you're trying to do as an organization. I often think about this, I'll give you a kind of analogy of kind of like rock climbing. So you imagine two people going rock climbing, and we got one in the bottom left-hand quadrant, one in the top right. Okay, so one's going to control the risk and the other one's going to take the risk. The person in the bottom left is the one that has the belay. So they've got the rope and a belay device, and you've got someone scaling up the rock face. And as they go up the rock face, they're going to put in the protective equipment as they go. But they're the ones kind of taking the risk, pushing the frontiers, doing something really new and exciting, sexy and fun. And you've got the person at the bottom's kind of a little bit bored. But the person at the bottom is so crucial to this, because if they let out too much rope, then the person, if they fall, will hit the ground, pull out all the protective equipment, you have a problem. If they don't let out enough rope, then you can't move forward. So it has to be a balance, and actually having some of those things in the bottom left that big organizations have maybe too much of, but those actually give you the confidence in order to do the innovative stuff. So you've got to have the two things working, but the balance, that profile is going to be completely different if you're a new tech startup, as I said earlier, to a nuclear power station.
And actually, it might be now a good time to move to the Q&A, because there's a question here around culture. But before we get onto that, I will just remind everyone, we can receive your questions here. We've got a list of them already, but please do contribute. We've got the team on the chat, so do pop in your questions. They're going to be fed through to us, and we've got about 25 minutes now to answer the rest of your questions. So please use this opportunity. One of our first questions, in fact, I think the first questions that we had for those who pre-registered, was talking around collaborative culture. And I think it goes to what you were saying about the appetite for risk, how much of the slack you give people to go and forge ahead. And they said sort of, I think this person's looking for some actual practical tips and a few simple objectives about how to get the right culture to have that resilience and not be too top down.
And so I'm going to answer that by referring to the first model and then that last set of processes. So the first bit is that model of the kind of profile shape is a profile of the organizational culture. You know, to what extent are you kind of more preventative control, or you're kind of more in that responsive, or it's all about efficiency, or it's all about innovation? What's the balance? That is culture. And you can think about that as in terms of culture, because you imagine as a leader and you've got your team, and that model's now saying, what are the messages you're sending to your member of staff? So on Monday morning, are you saying, I want you to be completely compliant and follow the rules religiously, don't deviate from that because we need to control risk? And on Tuesday morning, are you saying, I need you to improvise and be a creative problem solver? And on Wednesday morning, are you saying, I want you to drive for efficiency and get more from less? And on Thursday morning, you're saying, I want you to be really innovative. And probably by Friday, they're handing in their notice because yes. Like they're saying, like, how can I do all of these things? And what leaders say, what leaders do, what they role model sets the culture. So if you think about that profile shape, and for everyone here that has a team, think about what would your team say your personal profile was? How would they describe you in terms of that? What are the messages they are hearing from you? In terms of those 4 quadrants, because I think a lot of leaders think they're quite innovative, quite adaptive, pushing top right. The messages everyone else is hearing is it's kind of left side. It's optimize it and don't make a mistake.
And is that partly down to the KPIs people are set? It's about every touch point being consistent with that.
I mean, that's a really important point. And I kind of touched on this when I was I got the bit of blue tack and said this probably makes people feel a bit awkward, like what are you going to do with it? Everything on the left, the 2 on the left, are very measurable. We set KPIs, we set outcome goals, we can processes in place. Everything on the left, innovation in this kind of like more responsive, adaptive space is very uncomfortable. It's like, what are people actually going to be doing? How do we measure that? How do you control it in a way? And so particularly when we've got this real uncertain environment, I think most leaders want to go to the left. It's our comfort space. And often, because what happens if it does go wrong, we go, well, we did have a process in place. We did regulate it. We did audit it. We did check all the boxes, rather than saying, well, actually, we allow people to be really innovative or responsive. Okay, so the top right-hand side, difficult to measure, really awkward, makes us feel a bit anxious. But we know from COVID that innovation's the only exit strategy from a lot of big crises. It's the only way out. You know, we had to find vaccines. Every organization had to find a new way. Lots of organizations say that we've done more digital transformation in 6 months than we would have done in 6 years. So we kind of moved to the right-hand side and we learned how to cut some of that red tape. We did some of that stuff, but I got a feeling now that the tendency will always be a little bit more of a drift culturally back to the left.
Well, that's a really interesting point. How do you ensure that it's that proactive management, that the culture remains resilient rather than it's just a phase for when there is a war, when there is a pandemic? How do you stop an organisation from going back to its comfort zone?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a really important point. So first thing here is to say that I think there is a window of opportunity. And actually, a lot of organisations we've worked with have asked us to come and audit us and tell us, like, where do you think we are in terms of our resilience? And can we do it now? Because now's a really good time to make a change. If you do it 5 years from now, you've probably already kind of drifted back to the left-hand side. So I think that's an important aspect. I think it's got to stay under constant review because the environment's constantly changing. And we can't do this as a kind of process where we maybe once a year look at our risks, talk about risk appetite, and put the report back on the shelf. It has to be built into the way that we do business. And the set of processes that I put up on that slide, and we can share with people later, a bit more detail in there. But what that says is actually what we need to do is push the problem down and allow people more that are dealing with this problem to actually talk about how resilient they think they are. So I don't think this is for the senior leaders to decide. I don't think it's for the regulators to decide. I think it's for those that are responsible for delivering the service in conjunction with the end users. Like, we need to bring them into the conversation about this.
I actually think that might have answered a question. We've got a question here from Mark about maintaining resilience and challenging it surely requires buy-in from the top down, and how can you promote it to the wider workforce? But you're saying everyone's got responsibility for creating their resilience plan.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that I've seen, and I've been doing this kind of area for probably 20 years. One of the things that I've seen is that the whole idea of resilience and risk, business continuity, was always seen as a technical thing. And like, you would have a risk management team and you would have a committee that dealt with all of that stuff. What you see now is that that's no longer the case. So it has to be a strategic board level issue. This isn't just about like the managing risk. This is about how future ready are we as an organization? How are we currently operating? What is our culture of our organization like? Is that fit for the future? Are we able to deliver our mission going forward? That's a strategic issue. So it has to be owned by the SMT, the senior management team, the board, but it has to be done by the people that are managing resilience every day. So it has to be the two things. And what we kind of find when we work with organizations is we'll often do a workshop for the top team about awareness and getting them to talk about where do they think they are, where do they think they need to go, how might they lead the change. But we then spend a lot more time with the people that are delivering the services, really getting them to talk about end users, impact thresholds, the blueprinting of how they deliver that service. We work with them to how might we stress test this, what might be the financial case, and then you bring the two things together and say to the board again, like, do you want to invest in the resilience, or do you want to carry that risk moving forward?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the word invest, because I've got two questions actually relating to that. One is, I suppose, looking more at the SME perspective. Benjamin asks, resilience is described, seems more like a luxury requiring excess investments for the just in case. What would you say to SME businesses that are maybe so focused on day-to-day survival that this does seem like a luxury?
Yeah. So was that Justin?
Benjamin.
Benjamin. Sorry, Benjamin. Okay, so one way of thinking about this is, if Benjamin owns a house, is an insurance on the house a luxury? Because we have an insurance on the house in case something goes wrong, or do we actually see that as like a waste of? And lots of people don't have like life insurance or health insurance or house insurance. So if you think about, so what is the investment decision that we need to make? I think it has to be reasonable and proportionate to the purpose of your organization, what you're trying to achieve, the risks you face, and what the impact would be to the end users. So clearly there are going to be sectors where if it goes wrong, it's going to have a massive impact on the end user. And in those, you would expect a more of an investment in resilience. And I get the point that saying, well, hold on, if the impact's not that much, then maybe we shouldn't be investing so much. And I think it's absolutely right that that's the case. And we often talk about essential outcomes when we talk about the outcomes. And I think there's a lot of outcomes that organizations deliver that maybe aren't the essential ones. And we define the essential as what's going to have the impact on the end user. So there's a lot of services that, say, Cranfield delivers, that if we're disrupted, aren't really going to affect that end user that much. But if we have something that's going to affect the end user in Cranfield context, their ability to graduate and get a job afterwards, that's going to have a really disproportionate effect. And we ought to resource those things that are going to have the really big effect. So this actually helps you, because every organization, absolutely right, Benjamin here, that every organization's got a limited amount of money that it's going to invest in this. And we can't make everything infinitely resilient. So it's about where do we best place the limited resource that we have to give us the best return in terms of resilience. So really good question.
That's an interesting one. And actually, Lalit has asked, how can we represent the cost of preparing resilience with the ROI?
Yeah, I mean, that's similar to the last question, I think. Look, I think the question that I often get asked that's kind of associated with this is like, can you measure resilience and what's the ROI on resilience? And again, like let's think about resilience as a bit like personal health. So you think about your own personal health. You probably don't have one measure of how healthy you are. Like you don't have one measure of how resilient you are. And I wouldn't say to you, how much are you investing in your personal health to make sure you don't have an illness in the future? Okay, because you might go, well, hold on, that's quite hard because I've got to think about my mental health. I've got to think about my physical health. And even that, there's lots of different things, you know. So am I talking about diet? Am I talking about going to the gym?
And things contradict. I think I went to the gym, but I had a pizza.
Yeah, exactly. So this is why these tensions come into this. But you can start to say, well, hold on, there are some measures of this, and we can start to get some leading and lagging indicators of how resilient we might be. And we know what some of those dimensions are, and we know through using this approach what the cost of increasing resilience is. And it goes back to this point about you've then got a decision, once you've built this case for this is how much it's going to cost to be resilient. This is the exposure that we have, the risk that we have if we don't do it. What's the cost of not doing it? Now that's a decision that you need to make. But this, I think, gives you a more measurable way of doing it than we probably had in the past.
Well, thank you. That makes a lot of sense, actually. I know you said you didn't want to go too down into the academic rabbit hole, but we actually have two questions which I think can be answered together.
Right.
Dan wants to know, how does organisation resilience differ from traditional risk management disciplines such as ERM, incident crisis, disaster recovery, BCM? And we've also got Gary saying, well, how does this process differ from business continuity planning? Yeah.
So excellent questions. I see them as completely compatible. And I think I always see resilience as actually adding to some of those more traditional processes, standards, and ways of doing things. I do think that there are some subtle differences, or probably quite significant differences. In that model that I had that talks about like the top half, we've talked a lot about left side and right side in that model, the top half and the bottom half being very defensive. All of those approaches like risk management, business continuity, disaster recovery, etc., are all in the defensive. They don't really talk about progressive agenda, and actually not just about stopping things happening, but making stuff happen and being fit for the future. So I think resilience is more progressive focused. I think the other element that I would draw on here is to say this approach that we take to resilience is different to a kind of business continuity case with the focus on end user outcomes. A lot of business continuity, if you were to apply business continuity to this setup, this lovely studio, we often will look at how do we recover the asset or how do we recover the process. The resilience thinking is very much about how do we recover the outcome or what are the alternatives and options we have for the outcome. And what we realize is that the increasing scale and complexity of the disruptions we face might mean that we can't recover the asset, we can't recover the process, so we've got to innovate and find a new way to deliver the outcome. So for me, there are some differences, but that's not to say that we shouldn't be doing any of those things. It's that if risk management, so this is, I guess, a bit of a controversial point, if risk management, business continuity, disaster recovery, all of those things really worked, we would actually be much better prepared for the disruptions. So there's got to be more to this than that. And we think that resilience is the add-on more. It's not saying we do resilience instead of those things. It's that on top of those things, we've also got to be looking at this more progressive agenda and more user-centric, outcomes-focused.
That's interesting. The user-centric bit, we spoke yesterday about individual responsibilities for getting involved, and you mentioned learned helplessness. And we've actually had someone here mentioning it. Yusuf has asked about, do you believe antifragility? He mentions a book from Nassim Nicholas Taleb talking in his book. Can this complement a program of resilience?
Well, it's that the anti-fragility argument is literally that progressive argument. It's saying it's not just defensive, actually there's an upside to this resilience thinking. And actually in adversity, we actually see a lot of organizations succeeding. And you know, they come out and they actually either improve and deliver what they've always delivered much better than they did before, top left box, or they innovate and do something very different. So the anti-fragility argument is really the same as the progressive argument. It's just saying there is an upside to resilience, which I think, again, going back to the last question, that upside isn't in some of that more traditional thinking.
So can you give us a specific example about organisations that might have really thrived and really good examples of how to fully embrace resilient thinking?
So I think every organisation, if you look at every organisation, has moved forward with digital agenda out of COVID. I mean, we were forced to, weren't we? Like Cranfield had to put everything online, deliver all of our masters and executive programs with like 48 hours disruption, and we kind of did it. And I think a lot of organizations have done that and have responded in that way and driven into that top right hand box. And that's not to say that they're doing just what they've always done. It's actually completely new products and services. So I think, you know, we probably see that in nearly every organization that we've done that. But back to my point about there isn't one way to do resilience. So if you wanted to look at what are the archetype organizations, you'd have to go, well, which ones are actually more robust, bottom left, which ones are more responsive, which ones are actually more optimized, and which ones are more adaptive. And the question is though, is that fit for purpose? You know, you can do any of those in the wrong situation, actually cause more harm than good. So if you went into a local hospital and you needed to have an eye operation, you probably, like me, don't want it to be in the top right box. I don't want you to be really innovative today.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it has to be fit. So when you say, what's the organization example, it's more which ones are doing things that are fit for purpose than, you know, an exception in each one of those. And I think it's about the balance. It's about fit. It was Darwin, wasn't it? I think this quote's always attributed to Darwin. I'm not sure he actually said it exactly like this, but you know, it said it's not the strongest species that survive, it's the ones that are most adaptable to change. And it's, you know, it's the survival of the fittest. This notion of being fit for your environment is crucial.
No, that's a really good point, actually. We've got a question here about the capitals, 5 capitals.
Yep.
And Daryl has asked about reputational capital.
Yeah, so reputational capital we put under social capital. So that, yeah, Daryl, great question. So if you think about social capital, it's about the relationships between people and relationships between organizations. And for us, that encompasses things like trust, brand, reputation. And this is crucial. Like I said, each one of those 5 capitals are inputs, and you need all of those resources to build resilience, but there's also an impact in every one of those. So you need a certain set of relationships, networks, you need the trust as social capital to build resilience. But actually, if you have disruptive events, you don't deliver your essential outcomes, you start to erode your social capital. There's a loss of trust. And I think there's a survey recently that was talking about the loss of trust in the public sector and in government to address social issues. And that survey said that 86% of people are now looking at chief executives rather than politicians and the public sector to help address some of those future challenges. This is all about trust expectations that we have on organizations, growing number of B Corp organizations that have that kind of social purpose. So yeah, it's about social issues, it's about relationships. For any organization, what relationships do you have? What's the level of trust? What's the impact on brand and reputation when things go wrong? Again, back to that, looking, are we measuring that? What are our impact thresholds? What's an unacceptable level of brand damage to an organization? At what point would be cause for concern? Have you really looked across the organization? What a lot of organizations will do, interesting point here, that they'll look at what are the things that stop us having a reputational damage. But actually an event can happen, but what do we actually do afterwards to respond to that? So it's that other side as well. So do we actually have in place a strategy to respond when we have that reputational damage? So we can't just look at the preventative side, we have to also look at that response side.
And as a marketing specialist, I can't help but obviously be skewed towards the communications side of things.
Exactly.
And setting the expectations. And actually one of the questions we had pre-submitted was talking about managing expectations. And you've talked about that trust, but they said sort of, what about senior stakeholders who are impatient for results during periods of complex and dynamic change?
Yeah, and I mean, this is back to that point about the drift picture. Like, one of the real issues, and it's that kind of failure of imagination that I talked about as well. What tends to happen is, one of the most dangerous issues for organizations is a long period of nothing happening. Because we actually start to believe that we've built a really resilient system because we've kind of had no issues for a long time. And what we go back to is like my Lego, we start to, well, actually, we can start stretching the resource a little bit more. We can get more from less. We can maybe take out one of those backup systems that we had. Perhaps we don't need the 2 people that can do that one role because it hasn't gone wrong for a long time, has it? And over time, that confidence leads to complacency. And that's when you start looking backwards rather than looking at the waterfall in that image.
That failure of imagination, thinking it can't happen to us.
Yeah. Exactly. So this like long period of actual successful operation can be really problematic. I mean, if you look at, I give an example of top left box here, high street retail, long period of you've got the Woolworths, the Debenhams, the House of Fraser being really successful, big household names. And yet you've got the threat of Amazon coming in, probably 15 years ago. And if they'd have actually changed when Amazon was this big, like a little snowball, they could have done something. They could have changed. But actually, because we're still focused on we've been really successful, it can't happen to us. We're too big to fail. They don't change. What happens is Amazon's now a bloody great big avalanche. And it's not a matter of if the next high street retail organization is going to fail, it's when it's going to fail, because it's Amazon sweeping aside all of those organizations. Yet how many high street retail organizations have fundamentally changed their business model in that 15-year period? I often talk about resilience is about changing before the cost of not changing becomes too great. And so many organizations are reluctant to change what they think is a winning model because it won in the past, and they're not looking to winning in the future.
That's a really fascinating point, actually, a really fascinating point. And question, for people who are looking at what they need to do to take responsibility for looking forward, what sort of resources are there available to them?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is that I like that point that I have to take responsibility. It's so easy with this to go, oh, it's all too big. I can't make a difference to the resilience of my organization or even my department. But actually saying, well, hold on, I'm responsible for delivering service. Let's do this. Let's really think about what I can do differently. So if I was me, I would really want to think about this service, I'm going to make it resilient. If you want more information on this, 2 reports that we did, one with British Standards Institution, the other one in conjunction with Deloitte and the National Preparedness Commission. We're going to put a link out for people. Those are both freely available. You can get those from the Cranfield website. I've also put up on a slide a QR code. If you get your phone, ping that QR code for my LinkedIn. There's loads of information I put on LinkedIn on this. I've actually just set up a YouTube channel, really new. It'd be great if people could look at that and subscribe to that as well. So there's more information. Like, I'm trying to get the message out there and reach as many people as I can. That's why we're doing this webinar. And if people want to have a conversation then just get in touch. We're working with lots of different organizations at the moment. And one of the great things is every time we apply this in a different context, different situation, we learn something new. It moves our thinking on. It's really a collaborative co-production kind of approach here, because, you know, there isn't the blueprint for exactly doing this and applying it to every organization. Every organization's unique. And the more organizations we can work with, the more I think everyone's going to benefit.
I'm going to squeeze in one last question, because I know you wanted to talk about the specific exercises that maybe individuals can do, sort of plans on a page. What should someone do on Monday morning? Process this now, and on Monday, what should they do differently?
Yeah, so, I mean, it is very practical. The steps that we put on that slide, literally, if we were working with an organization, it's come together, bring a team from people with different perspectives. That's the key thing, from different levels in the organization together, and to actually start answering some of those questions. Who are our end users? Are there different types of end users? Are there different needs? What are our impact thresholds? Do we really understand how we deliver this service? What would be the thresholds there? How might we stress test this? Do we really understand it? And you can start working through those questions, and literally it is a really creative process to do that.
Fantastic, thank you. I mean, that is the last one we can squeeze in, but now that we know you have a YouTube channel, what I may suggest is that all of these questions that we've received, we'll be sending over to David, and you've now got plenty of topics to cover in your next videos on YouTube, so they won't go to waste. We do have the next Future of Everything webinar booked in. It's actually not until the 2nd of November, but it is excitingly in the studio. We are going to have the amazing Dr. Stephanie Hustles, who will be talking about entrepreneurship being at the heart of every business. She's absolutely incredible. She's the director of our Bettany Centre here at the School of Management. So highly recommend you register now. Full details will be coming out. We'll also be making a recording of this webinar available. So for anyone who's joined halfway through, keep an eye out for your emails, because a recording will be going out. And we are now out of time, so I just have to say thank you so much, David.
And thanks for all those questions. They were great, weren't they?
Some great questions. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a cracking day.